Hi everybody, welcome to our study of early church history. That's the first 6 centuries of the early church. I'm going to be reading out loud from this particular book, the Moore College study course on early church history. And what I'm going to do is literally read it out loud and then pause every now and then with a little bit of amplification, a little explanation if I think we need that. But before we start that, let me just say there are 2 words I'd like us to understand before we go into our study. One of those is the word doctrine, D-O-C-T-R-I-N-E. And doctrine is any set of beliefs that an organisation holds. Obviously in the church it's Christian doctrine, the beliefs we hold. You can get doctrine in governments, in political parties, and even in the army. There's an army doctrine of how we conduct things. So doctrine is an important word, and what we're going to be doing is looking in church history. What is very important is the development of doctrine. The other word I'd like us to remember is orthodox. You know the word orthodontist? It's a word that means straight teeth, orthodent. Well, orthodox is a word that means ortho, straight, dox, opinion or truth. So we'll be looking at orthodox, straight, truth or opinion doctrines later on as we go through these church histories and how it develops. So let me just start by saying that I'm going to say why we need to understand church history. So as Christians, we're used to looking back in one sense at history because the Bible is set in historical circumstances, real circumstances, and that's one of the reasons why we understand it to be truth, because it's set in real life, recorded in the past. And in our evening services, we understood how it was very important to understand the history of the times when we studied Daniel. It was very important. The big difference between Bible history and the history of the church is that the Bible was written down by people inspired by God. So God's supernatural activity went into the recording of history in the past, in the Bible, to explain how God works in history. With church history, it's a little different. It's not inspired, and the sources come from a whole variety of areas. They come from people's records at the time of what was going on in the world, how the church was developing, and we have a whole variety even of non-Christians writing about the Christian church. One of the things, for example, that we've got here is there's a gentleman called Tacitus, who was a Roman senator, and Tacitus wrote about events in Rome that were actually influenced by somebody called Christ. So let me just read this to you. It says about the great fire of Rome, which people believed Nero started. It says this: but all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the fire was the result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominable religion. They were called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And it is a most mischievous superstition. Now already we've got people there from history outside of the Bible who are mentioned in the Bible. Tiberius comes up in Luke, and Pontius Pilate in most of the accounts too. So we start to see how not only do we get Christians writing about church history, but we also get other sources, they're called, referring to church and Christian activity. And that's really helpful if we want to explain things to other people, because it immediately banishes the idea that it is a myth, because other people are reporting on things that happened at the time. And Tacitus, for example, was writing about 60 years after Jesus lived, died and went back to heaven. So why do we need to understand church history? Well, church history records the development of doctrine. Doctrine, that set of beliefs where we synthesize or bring down ideas to simple word forms. So, for example, the word sin is in the Bible, but is only explained in terms of the Bible and in stories and accounts. Salvation, sanctification, these are all doctrines. What is our set of beliefs about sin, salvation, sanctification, or another one, substitution theology as well. So in church history, we see how various church people wrote history to develop the doctrines in their own context, in their own history, so that we can see what these doctrines are clearly and understand them from the Bible. Now, the New Testament was not, and never has claimed to be a textbook of doctrines, but it does contain everything we need for Christian faith and life. So the doctrines come out of the New Testament, and in church history people discuss the New Testament and then form these doctrines so that we can simply explain what we believe and how we live by those beliefs. So church history enables us to see the challenges and preserving of Bible truth. In history, people were challenged about what Jesus was, who Jesus is. Was he really half God, half man, or both at the same time? And in history, people discussed the events of the New Testament and came up with doctrines, and they were challenged. So as we look back at the development of doctrine, we can see in history the heresies, the false truths that were put forward, either to make people live conveniently in their sinful ways, or actually sometimes just because people were mistaken. And people died for these truths, even at the hands of other Christians. Why do we need to know that? The same heresies, the same challenges to truth and doctrine come up in every generation. As we look back at history, we can see how the doctrines, the truths were developed and what fought against them and how they were brought out. So we can actually use church history to defend the Christian faith within the church and outside the church today. So I've got 4 particular things today. Here's a focus of our church studies in the early church studies. First of all, we're going to find the making, the challenging and the defining of doctrines as people tried to understand the great truths of the Christian faith from the New Testament and the Old Testament combined. The church events that happened, including the spread of the gospel and the growth of what was a formal, even a political church. We'll see the political movements, historical political movements that affected the growth of the church, that challenged truth, or in some cases carried the church along. There are examples of that where it was so well recognized as a good thing that the church was helped by political movements. And then we're going to be looking at the social climate of the early centuries, including a brief study of the background of the Christian era. We need to know how they lived, the context in which they lived, so we can better understand how the doctrines and teachings of the Bible were carried out. So the study of church history isn't free from bias and interpretations. In that case, it's unlike the Bible. The original observers and recorders of church history each had their own biases and interpretations. And so we can see how other people applied the Bible to those biases and interpretations in their own culture and context, so that they could see how to live truthfully. I mean, we may not be able to understand this, but at one time it was a sincerely held belief that slavery was okay. And it was only as people applied the Bible to Christian living that that was then seen to be the wretched thing that it is. In the same way, many Christians believe that certain moral practices are okay. And it's only as people apply the Bible to those moral practices that we see how we should be living best and most enjoyably for God. That's what Christian history does for us, helps us to see how we need to challenge certain beliefs from the Bible and develop them. So similarly, we are influenced by our Christian backgrounds and cultures, and more particularly by our convictions about truth. And our own cultures can often influence or bias us, so that we need to challenge those biases. And sometimes that can be, in church history, a painful, even a dangerous thing to do, and it could be similarly so today. But we can take encouragement from the way people lived the Bible out in church history. So absolute truth or objectivity and being very careful is not always possible, but we have lots of documents that can help us to understand how people and how things went on in those days. Now, the big picture for the purposes of church history, there are three main areas of interest. The first is the period of the early church, which is what we're studying now, largely set against the background of the Roman Empire and some of the things that came up to the dominance of the Roman Empire. And that reaches to around about the end of the 500s, that kind of culture. The second period, which would be another book, is the Protestant Reformation that occurred in Western Europe and utterly changed everything. But that's another study. And obviously, after something called the Enlightenment, the period of the Enlightenment, do feel free to look that up, the Enlightenment, then we have the modern church and its growth and challenges. But we're going to be looking at the early church. And first of all, we're going to look at the Roman Empire. The last time Judea is mentioned in the Old Testament, it's part of the Persian Empire under the rule of Darius, and you can get that in Nehemiah 12. We also find that there is no mention of anything after around about 400 and Malachi. So there is a silence of 400 years, but there's still history going on. 3 or more centuries after Darius and the Persian Empire, the New Testament opens with the Romans ruling the Near Eastern stage amid cultures with varying degrees of Greek influence. Up until the Roman influence, one of the dominant people was Alexander the Great, and he influenced the world so much that the world spoke in its intellectual levels and government levels Greek. And you may or may not know this, but the New Testament is written in Greek, Common Greek as it's called. And then after Alexander, he set up 4 different kingdoms which came from his generals. They then spread out and were in conflict with each other, and these are all backgrounds to the New Testament understanding of culture and the Christian church. So it's against this backdrop of Roman rule that the early church is established, and the separating of Greek, Jewish and Roman elements of that backdrop is something we're going to have to look at. How do we separate Greek culture overlapping with Roman culture and underpinned all of the time in that area by Jewish culture? It sounds a little bit difficult, but actually it helps us to understand what was actually going on in the New Testament. So before the rise of Roman power, it was Greek rule under Alexander the Great, as we said. And a lot of people were influenced by Greek culture. For example, there were lots of Jewish people who started to do something that the Bible really didn't like and that the Jewish culture found abominable, and that was to do sports naked. Sounds a bit daft, but it was something that was very common in Greece. And that culture influenced a lot of stuff that was going on in Jewish culture at that time too. Now, by the end of the 4th century BC, Roman power was growing in the west. Rome fought and won 3 major wars called the Punic Wars against her chief rival, Carthage. Now, if you look at a map or go on holiday, you can see the extent of the Carthage or Carthaginian Empire. Although they were based in North Africa, near Tunisia, they also had an empire. So if you go to Spain, southern Spain, you may have been to a place called Cartagena, spelt Cartagena. It used to be New Carthage. And then Roman influence went into Spain. And by the time we get Paul coming along, his biggest ambition is to send a mission to Spain. So the Punic Wars were won, and Rome started to take dominance of the Mediterranean area and beyond. We find that there were lots of influences in all the islands and countries around the Mediterranean. In the east, that is in Judea and the Israelite areas, Rome was also having victories, and within a short period of time, Rome defeated Macedonia, part of Greece, took Egypt under its protection, and began to rule over Syria, a great backdrop for the Old Testament. The eastern part of Asia Minor, that's that far eastern part, was given to Rome by its last king, making Asia Minor a Roman province. So what we're finding is that Roman influence was very heavy throughout that period, but there were benefits to the gospel and the Christian church. Because the Roman Empire went from being a republic, that is a democracy kind of, to an empire, which then dominated both economically, militarily, and politically in an area, what we find is that travel was very, very easy. In the past, if you wanted to travel, say, from Jerusalem to Athens, you had to have armed people to go with you, which meant only the rich could really do it, or a whole load of trade people could gather together with protection, and they would still be vulnerable to attack. So communications, the spread of information, was very, very difficult until the Romans brought what was called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And it meant that the ordinary person could travel along the wonderful roads that the Romans built, and which the Romans protected with their soldiers, policing those roads. So an ordinary person like Paul, without much money, without many defenders, could walk from Jerusalem through to Greece and on to Rome. And the same as well, piracy on the high seas. It meant that people could now travel safely by sea and more quickly as well. So the way the Romans developed things, it meant that people would be able to spread the news, the extraordinary news of the gospel, by word of mouth, but also by written documents, like the New Testament letters. Now, Roman government from 27 BC onwards was under a man called Augustus, and we have him mentioned at the time of the birth of Jesus. And again, it became a very powerful government which allowed a lot of freedom to trade. I have a little portrait of Augustus here, and it was written by a Jewish person who lived in Alexandria, where there was a great Jewish community. And he said, "This is the man who exterminated wars, both of the open kind and the covert kind, and brought about the end of the raids by brigands." This man who would be a natural enemy of Augustus, actually admitted that Augustus brought peace in every area. So, during a period of reform, the nature of Roman citizenship also came under review. It gave a lot of privileges, and we can see that in Paul's life in the New Testament. He became a Roman citizen under certain developments, and that allowed him to continue freely to spread the gospel, and even when he was arrested, to get freed. The system Augustus implemented brought peace. His rule established, as I've said before, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace throughout the known world. And apart from occasional localized warfare, most regions enjoyed peace from about 30 BC to the end of the 2nd century and beyond AD. Now, the impacts these changes in Roman government and Augustus's rule of the empire made on the spread of the gospel were considerable, it says. It was an environment of peace and stability, allowing trade to flourish. It was now safe to travel for the rich and the poor. And this brought about with it economic prosperity, and further enhanced by a common currency, that is money. A wider exchange of ideas accompanied the increased trade as well. Now, with the spread of empire, two common languages were established. Latin in the west, around Rome, and Greek in the east, around Israel still. People still spoke Greek. It's a little bit like around the world, because of the British Empire, whether you love it or hate it, it established English language as a lingua franca, a common language that a lot of people spoke. And even such a vast country as, say, India, a lot of people, even on the railways and in the smaller municipal areas, spoke English. It wasn't just for the elite, and it allowed communication and the exchange of ideas. So there was a considerable travelling population of government officials and merchants, which meant authority went with them, and there was now a common rule of justice. And actually, in terms of the Far East and of history, this justice was very fair. At least when you had a set of rules and laws that everybody adhered to and they could be measured and challenged, it meant that you could plan for the future, because you didn't have to just say, oh, that person will have that view, that person will have that view, and you have to bribe them. The law made the future certain, and you could plan. So there was a strong sense of renewal and a new beginning accompanying the end of the post-war-ridden republican years of the Roman Empire. And the literature of the Augustan age, that is, the writings that people did, reflects this expectation of peace and prosperity. Now, for Christians, this was heightened as the birth of Jesus occurred in Augustus's reign. Now, I'm going to look very briefly at Roman religion, which is very important because religions often came into conflict with Christian religion. So, for example, I read that article by Tacitus, and Tacitus called it a sinister superstition because they totally understood Holy Communion. They really thought people were eating bodies and drinking blood, which they found disgusting. So it's very important to understand what their culture was and how it conflicted with the Christian culture. By and large, Christians could live very easily under Roman rule, but at one stage they started to develop the cult of the emperor. And when the emperor is the senior god to whom you bow down, it's all very well to follow all the rules, but a Christian cannot compromise his faith. And that was a death penalty if you could not bow down to or sacrifice to the Roman emperor. And Augustus's religious policy was that emperor cult. Emperor cults were not a novelty in the ancient world, nor in our world. There are many leaders who demand to be worshipped as a god. Take, for example, North Korea. The previous president, when he died, people really did think that all good things came from him, like a god. And there were thousands who committed suicide when he died. How can you live without your God? So it's nothing new then, and it's nothing new now, but it does come into conflict with the Christian understanding of who God is. So Augustus had two policies, one for Rome, another for everywhere else that was ruled by Rome. And in these places, temples, altars, priests, and games were all held in his honour. Really good political advertising to make the top man the most important man and associated with all enjoyment, religion and government. So in Rome, keen not to offend conservative people, the requirement was simply involvement in the cult. You just had to do something every now and then. But elsewhere, it showed your loyalty to Rome, and therefore there were severe penalties. Roman culture, at the days of the early empire, while bringing significant changes, provided little by way of technical advancement. Stuff stayed the same. You still fought with a sword and a shield and a helmet. You still hunted with a bow and arrow. You still travelled on a horse in a cart. The economy flourished and the population grew, but there were few specific technological developments. So in some ways, things stayed the same. And the population increase meant a people movement towards cities and major centres of trade and industry. And when people brought the gospel, because of these people movements, they reached far more people far more quickly, and you got that cohesion of groups of people changing together and developing. This is why it's really helpful to know church history, to see what happens with social developments and how that helps the gospel grow. So, for example, looking back on these sort of developments, Christians have written articles on how to spread the gospel, to reach the cities, to go to people groups, to go to ethnic groups, and then how to understand it should be spread. So we can use our brains as well as our prayers. So in these growing cities, morality was quickly debased. Morals fell. And it was aided by Roman fascination with blood sports and public executions and unrestrained enjoyment of life, because some people had more money and more stuff than they'd ever had before. Does that sound common? Church history shows how people move away from their faith when they have far too much stuff. And the Bible itself talks about it. Evidence from grave monuments and other letters witness to family loyalties and affections among common people, and show how society was very normal in that respect too. The official cult, the official religion, contributed little to morality, contrasting strongly with the Judeo-Christian tradition, which had a strong appeal in this respect. There is an instinct about what is good and moral and helpful in a society, and yet there is also an unrestrained desire to do whatever you like. And when the Judeo-Christian morality was held up, and people often respected it even if they weren't Christians, other people find that it measures them and judges them, and so they oppose it too. And I think we can find that as well in our church development even today. We find that some people want to live with stuff, they want to do whatever they want to like, they want to do, and we find that the Christian doctrine offends that, and so people kick back against it. So Jewish culture, there were Greeks in Judea who influenced Jewish culture morally and also in terms of intellect too. There were Romans in Judea who also influenced things, and we can see that. We find that the Greek and the Romans, whether it's Archelaus, whether it's Herod, whether it's Philip of the other areas there, we find that these people all influence what goes on in the early church area of Judea. Now, I've got a few things that are worth mentioning here, because they come up a lot in the Bible, they come up a lot in the New Testament, and these are sort of the officials and organizations of the early Judean or Jewish parties and sects. We had the high priests. So when Judea became a Roman province, the position of high priest, which for so long had been an appointment of political expediency, in other words, you can have this post if you pay me some money and if you bring me influence. The high priest became the obvious representative and spokesman of the Jewish people when working with Roman politics. So all of a sudden the religion becomes important under Roman politics, the high priests. The Sadducees, most of these high priests came from the party of the Sadducees. These wealthy aristocratic families maintained their strong political position by sucking up to the Romans, basically. And yet what was interesting about their theology, they had no theology of life after death. The Pharisees, the origins of the Pharisees are obscure. They appear, however, to have emerged from the early Hasidim, or godly people, and they fought for religious purity and died very often. The Sanhedrin was kind of the parliament that the Romans would deal with. There was also something, the Qumran peoples were people who went off like monks and started to study the Bible and write things about the Bible. The Zealots were nationalists who used the Bible and the Maccabees for their understanding of how the Jewish people should be working. So in the early Roman Empire there were Jews everywhere. There were Jews, a strong Jewish community in Alexandria in Egypt. There were in modern Turkey, there were strong groups of Jewish people meeting in their synagogues. And there were still Jews in Babylon in the Far East as well, meeting in their synagogues. And these people had trade and political influence as well, simply because of the educational background that was common to Jewish people. And although no uniform description of Judaism can be given, certain aspects remained both in Israel, that is Palestine today, and perhaps more so in the dispersion throughout the rest of the world, despite the effect of when in Rome do as the Romans do, the Jews stuck to their distinctive religious rules. Not doing work on the Sabbath, honouring God, all sorts of things which made them different from the other places. And it was centred on synagogues. Synagogues existed in Palestine and even in Jerusalem, even when there was a temple, but in the dispersion it was the only place they could meet to read the scriptures together. And in those synagogues that Paul would head to the synagogues to teach the new faith, the understanding of the old faith. The following facts about Judaism, Jewish religion, aided the spread of the gospel. Synagogues throughout the Mediterranean provided a platform for preaching the gospel. Christianity, like Judaism, offered monotheism and life after death. And initially, Rome did not distinguish between Jewishness and Christianity. They thought Christianity was a subset, a sect of Judaism, and so tolerated it. The problem was that the Jews had exemption from worshipping the emperor, a unique one. And it was only after agitation by the Jews that Christians were recognized as not just a subset of Judaism, but as a distinct organization, a distinct religion, and they lost the protection. And so Christians became persecuted if they could not or would not submit to the emperor as a god. The translation of the Old Testament to Greek in 132 BC provided the scriptures, the Old Testament called the Septuagint or the 70, in a Greek common language for anybody else to understand. And then the dispersing of Christians from Jerusalem, which we get in Acts 8, helped the spread of the gospel as it went as far as Rome. It's important to know the Greek heritage, and there are two particular philosophies which again we've mentioned in our evening services. These are Epicureanism and Stoicism. Stoicism was very well recognised and is part of our Christian background. We see it in Acts 17 with Paul challenging the Stoics and the Epicureans. Stoics were people who basically believed in the stiff upper lip. You didn't allow your emotions to show, and if bad stuff happened, you smiled as much as if good stuff happened. It was just a way of coping with the vagaries of life. Epicureanism was kind of eat, drink and be merry, because tomorrow you die. Those bits come obviously from the Bible themselves, but it was people who did not believe in life after death, so enjoy it to the best of your ability. Of course, for rich people, that was far easier than for very poor people. So we find that Platonism as well, a form of logic, was very important. But in the end, we find that the empire-wide use of the Greek language meant that Paul could address people in Greek. Have a look at Acts 21. And there was no cross-cultural difference because they spoke the same language. That's why it's important to know how history works. There was a tentative movement towards one God. Lots of people started to move towards the understanding of just one God philosophically in different religions. And the appeal of the many and various Greek and Eastern mystery cults was something that challenged and was attractive to other people. Well, so far, there we are. We have covered the Roman influences, the Greek influences. We've covered the Jewish background to the New Testament. We've seen how the spread of the gospel occurred because of the power of Rome in the Pax Romana. And now, later on, we're going to start to be looking at real church history from the New Testament onwards. We'll be looking at it with those other influences and backgrounds and contexts, so that when we come to our own context, we can see how our culture, our context, our local thinking challenges Christian belief, and we can work hard understanding what is true and what is not. And then ultimately, of course, to share the Christian faith from our context too. Now, if you would like to, there is a book here called the New Bible Dictionary. This is one we use for the ladies in the ladies' Bible study. And this is a great dictionary. If you would like a dictionary, I think I can make these available to you. But if you would like to read the article in here called The Roman Empire, it's fascinating. It's not just old stuff, guys. It's actually old stuff that helped the spread of the gospel and helps us to understand how our history, our time. So, for example, coronavirus, how is that going to affect the spread of the gospel and challenges to the truth? You'll find that in history there will be models and answers that we can use to keep the spread of the gospel. So do feel free to look at that. Now, as you look at Roman history or Greek history, just ask yourself, what was it about their power, about their culture, and about their time that caused difficulties for the Christian religion, that opposed it? And what was it about their culture and their time that helped the Christian gospel spread? And then just start thinking about our own situation. Well, look, guys, do feel free to contact me personally on my mobile or on WhatsApp personally. If you found this helpful or unhelpful and what you would like us to change, okay? That's a broad spread in a short time, but that's the background to the early church and its developments as we look at challenging, changing and holding on to the truth of God. Thanks, guys. Have a good day, and don't forget to be in touch with any questions or any challenges to the way we do this. Take care. Bye-bye.